So I'm really excited about tonight. We have got a fantastic therapist and a fantastic person, Angie Riding from Tensegrity Council, joining us to share some of what she thinks could be powerful and good information for you guys. So Angie, I'm going to kill my camera. The floor is all yours. Change the world.
All right. Thanks, Derek. Okay. Let me get the PowerPoint pulled up here so you guys can see the information I've put together for you. So as Derek mentioned, my name is Angie Ridings, and I am the owner of Tensegrity Counseling Associates in Edmond, Oklahoma. And Derek asked me to pick a time I could talk to you guys and pick a topic. So a really great book that I recently read is called Prodependence, and I thought it was such a great concept that I would introduce this to you guys. So I've entitled this presentation, Reframing Codependence into Prodependence. All right, so here's the book that I've taken all this material out of today, and it's written by a colleague of mine. His name is Rob Weiss. He's a certified sex addiction therapist and a specialist. So I've gotten trained in some of the same trainings as him, and I really love the spin that he has put on codependency. All right, so let's start out with a case study. I think this will help you guys really conceptualize this idea. So let's take this this scenario here. It's a cancer diagnosis. We've got a couple, George and Sally, and they've been married 12 years, and they have 2 kids under the age of 10, and Sally gets diagnosed with cancer. So George, he goes into survival mode, and he has to keep his family stable. So he takes on a second job. He stops going to the gym after work. He drops out of the company basketball league. He stops hanging out with friends. He becomes hyper-focused on taking care of the kids, paying the bills, and of course, Sally's health. And the question here is, would anybody label George enmeshed or enabling for going to such drastic measures to take care of his family? I think the majority of us would say absolutely not. So George then starts therapy to get some support and help him through the process. And so the next question is, should the therapist start exploring George's childhood for dysfunction to explain his unhealthy obsession with his wife's cancer? That sounds pretty ludicrous in this scenario, I think. So what we would call this is a healthy, loving attachment to his wife. All right, so let's change a few of the details here. Same scenario, George and Sally, married 12 years, 2 kids under the age of 7. Sally gets addicted to pain pills and alcohol. Sally loses her job for being under the influence at work. She can no longer be trusted to care for the kids adequately because of her addiction. George has to keep the family stable. So he takes a second job. He stops going to the gym after work. He quits the company basketball league. He stops hanging out with friends for a while. He becomes hyper-focused on paying the bills, taking care of the kids, and Sally's drinking and using. Would family, friends, employer, clergy, and a therapist support George in this level of caretaking while showing compassion for how exhausted and frustrated he might be? And a lot of people would say, no, we wouldn't support that because we're talking about addiction. So these attempts are usually judged poorly and called dysfunctional in the addiction world. And caregiving often gets labeled as enmeshed, enabling, controlling, dysfunctional, having abandonment issues, codependent, or co-addict. So let's talk for a minute about the stigma of addiction. A lot of people call it a moral failing, a sign of inherent weakness. It's often called a family disease where everybody gets labeled pathologically unwell. The family feels a lot of shame, which often leads to silence. And the addiction is going to thrive in secrecy, like addiction does. Outsiders encourage intervention, and then detaching and distancing from the addict. Anything beyond this often turns into blaming, shaming, and pathologizing, and they're labeled codependent. So next, let's talk about loved ones and addiction treatment. So codependence, it assumes that loved ones are recreating childhood trauma by partnering with an addict. Prodependence takes a completely different stance on this. Prodependence looks at the situation through an attachment perspective. There's no shame, blame, or judgment. And yes, it's still possible that the partner has a trauma history, but this is not the focus of their treatment or their recovery. So quickly, let's talk about understanding addiction. Most addicts are trauma survivors, the research tells us. And I like this quote that Dr. Weiss has in his book on page 29. He says, "It is clear from both research and clinical observation that addictions are not about feeling good. They're about feeling less. Addicts turn to addictive substances and behaviors not because they want to have a good time, but to self-medicate and self-regulate their emotions. Their primary goal is to escape from life and to not feel stress, anxiety, depression, fear, and other forms of discomfort." So when we're talking about addiction, really what we're talking about is brain chemicals. So we have dopamine, which is for pleasure. We've got adrenaline, which is the excitement. We've got oxytocin, which is love and connection. We've got serotonin, which is about emotional well-being, and then endorphins, which is about euphoria. And escape continues until other problems surface, such as relationship issues, trouble at work or school, declining physical or emotional health, financial turmoil, legal problems, mood disorders, all kinds of things. So really, we're all made with the need to connect. It's a human need. So what we're going for here is healthy interdependence. And Dr. Weiss describes healthy interdependence as this: without healthy dependency and connection, we may make it physically, but we won't be happy. When we go it alone, we fail to thrive. And this deeply ingrained need for emotional connection does not abate simply because a person with whom we feel an intimate bond is challenged by an addiction or some other serious issue. So attachment and emotional well-being is based on attachment theory and the attachment research that's been done by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth. And the attachment research says that a person who grows up with caregivers who are absent, impaired, addicted, neglectful, anxious, inconsistent, intrusive, mentally ill, overbearing, or unreliable develop an insecure attachment style in relationships. So insecure attachment, what this means really is that a person will learn to become an escapist through substances and or behaviors to avoid feelings, and repeated attempts to bond with people who are unable to meet that need. They rely on others for self-esteem rather than build self-esteem from within. They can be overly controlling towards others and their environment. They might be overly self-sufficient and put up a lot of walls. They might fail to trust. They won't let people in who are trustworthy. and isolating emotionally and or physically with or without an addiction or psychological disorder. So here's some main points about attachment theory. Everyone will attach either securely or insecurely. And attachment style develops early in life, usually during the infant or toddler years. Now, basic attachment style will typically stay the same over the lifespan, but we can learn to get our attachment needs met, usually through therapy. An insecure attachment, we must learn to attach in healthier ways by becoming vulnerable. So being vulnerable means risking rejection, abandonment, and everything else that fed into our insecure style of attachment. And this little reminder here, I just want to remind everyone that there are no perfect parents anywhere. So the goal is good enough parenting in attachment. Good enough parenting means responsive in healthy and appropriate ways, enough of the time that the child learns to trust and develops a secure sense of attachment. But the parent is not perfectly responsive all the time. And the parent's imperfection forces the child to grow and to develop in ways that support and encourage self-esteem and self-sufficiency, while still allowing the child to feel mostly securely attached. So the same concept comes to play with loving somebody with an addiction. We provide love and support, but we allow them to grow by living and experiencing their life, even addiction-related consequences. So prodependence then is attachment relationships that are healthfully interdependent, where one person's strengths support the vulnerabilities of the other, or vice versa, with this mutual support occurring automatically and without question. Addict behavior, as we all know, is unpredictable. It's about blaming, lies, seducing, manipulating, gaslighting. This will make anybody feel or look crazy over time and can put the loved ones in a crisis. People in crisis look crazy. So prodependence validates caregiving as a loving act. And I really like these comparisons on page 75 of the Prodependence book. So let's just go through these real quick. So codependent would call someone enmeshed. Prodependent would call it deeply involved. Codependent says externally focused. Prodependent says concerned about the welfare of others. Codependency says enabling. Prodependent calls it supporting. Codependent calls it fearful. Prodependent calls it concerned. Codependent says lacking healthy boundaries. Prodependent says eager to care for a loved one. Codependency says they can't say no. Prodependency says they choose to say yes. Codependency says obsessed with an addiction. Prodependency says determined to protect the addict and family. Codependency says living in denial. Prodependency says unwilling to give up on a loved one. Codependency would call it angry. Prodependency would say fearful of further loss without control. Codependency calls it controlling. Prodependency calls it trying to be heard. Codependency says you're being hypervigilant. Prodependency says you're anticipating problems. So you see the reframe happening here is putting a positive spin on these behaviors in an effort to enhance connection and attachment. Okay, so real quick, let's talk about recovery. So recovery for the addict means that they have to learn to replace destructive coping mechanisms. And they need to learn how to develop healthy ego strength and self-esteem and have a strong social support. So this happens through fellow recovering addicts. That's what our 12-step meetings are all about. And empathic family and friends. And I like this quote on page 83 of the book. The only way for addicts to overcome the early life trauma that drives their addiction is to be in relationship with healthy people who treat them with kindness, empathy, and respect. For addicts to overcome addiction, they need to become healthfully attached to people rather than an addictive substance or behavior. So early on, both addicts and their loved ones are in crisis. And the goal early on is to get out of crisis mode by leaning into therapy, support groups, and friends. You can't be there for your loved one and have a healthy attachment until you're out of crisis mode. So loved ones need self-care. And I liken self-care to the oxygen on an airplane. You've heard the analogy of the oxygen mask falls down. Who's the first person you put it on? If you're with a child, you put it on yourself first so that you can care for your child. Same concept here. We got to have self-care. We have to be able to take care of ourselves or we won't be there for our loved ones. We'll be a wreck. We'll be exhausted. We'll be sick. The next thing that we need is boundaries. So boundaries are focused on your own behavior, not the addict's. And I really like these details out of the book. So Dr. Weiss mentions the hula hoop analogy. So this is where you realize you can only control what's in your immediate space, which is you, your words, your actions, and how you choose to respond to things. And I like the second rule too, when applying boundaries, the concept of not my circus, not my monkeys. So in other words, if a problem isn't of your own making, then it's not yours to fix. So leave it alone. And then this third one here, so the purpose of healthy boundaries is not about keeping others out, but rather keeping people safely in or letting people safely in. So their behavior belongs to them. All right, so that concludes our presentation. Here is the source for Dr. Weiss's book, Prodependence, Moving Beyond Codependency. And I appreciate everybody's time. So Derek, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Awesome, man. What a, I guess like timely presentation. I think the questions we get asked the most with Parents Helping Parents, really with any family that I'm working with, is how they deal with boundaries, how they deal with codependency. And so beautiful stuff. So Angie, did you tell everybody how to get in touch with you if they want more information about what services you guys offer or about Tensegrity?
I forgot to put that on a slide. So our website is tensegrityok.com, or you can just Google Tensegrity, which is TENSEGRITY. And awesome. My email is angie.ridings@gmail.com.
Excellent. Thank you so much again, Angie. So we're going to be flipping over here in just a few moments to our live Q&A. So that you're going to have an opportunity to interact with Angie, to ask questions, to really engage in some conversation for as long as we want. We've got plenty of time. So if you're watching live on Facebook, I commented the Zoom link, the passcode, and the Zoom meeting ID in the Facebook comments so that you can find the Q&A information there. If you're watching on Zoom, I also sent that in a chat to everyone, I believe. I did not. I just sent it to the panelists. So let me resend that to everybody so that everybody in Zoom has it, not just Angie. All panelists and attendees, paste. There we go. So now everybody should have it in their comments section. I'm going to give people about 30 seconds to kind of write that information down or open a new window. You're not going to be able to enter that room until I officially click over in about 30 seconds. But like we said, we would love to have you join us there so that you can engage in some conversation with Angie and I. If it's just me and Angie, we'll engage in our own conversation, which will be plenty interesting. So I'm going to end the live stream now. I'm going to end the meeting now, and I will see everybody in the live Q&A here in just a few moments.